And thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. Well, give it a little more time to let people in the room with us. I'm just going to start with a little housekeeping. The structure of this event will first be introductions, then a program interview with author Steve Paul, and lastly, we will have time to take any questions and comments. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to write your concern in the chat box, and we can assist you there. To ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to raise your hand to be unmuted or type it in the chat box or Q&A box, and we will address those questions and comments at the appropriate time. Evan S. Connell emerged from the American Midwest, determined to become a writer. He eventually made his mark with attention-getting fiction and deep explorations into history. His linked novels, Miss Bridge and Mr. Bridge, paint a devastating portrait of the lives of a prosperous suburban family, not unlike his own, that, more than half a century later, continue to haunt readers and with their minimalist elegance and muted satire. As an essayist and historian, Connell produced a wide range of work, including a sumptuous body of travel writing, a best-selling epic about account of Custer at the Little Bighorn, and a singular series of meditations on history and human tragedy. The first portrait and appraisal of an under-recognized American writer is based on personal accounts by friends, relatives, writers, and others who knew him, extensive correspondence in library archives, and insightful literary and cultural analysis of Connell's work and its context. It also illuminates aspects of American publishing, Hollywood, male anxieties, and the power of place. Author Steve Paul worked for the Kansas City Star for 40 years as a reporter, writer, and editor. He is the author of 2 books, including Hemingway at 18, the pivotal year that launched an American legend. He lives in Kansas City, Missouri. Please welcome Steve Paul for a conversation on his latest book, Literary Alchemist, The Writing Life of Evan S. Connell. Welcome, Steve.
Oh, thank you, Jessica. Very glad to be here. I love Santa Fe, and it's been too long since I've been down there, but glad to be with you today, virtually.
Yeah, thank you. Before we get into our conversation, would you mind reading a chapter from Literary Alchemists that I think our Santa Fe community would really enjoy?
I will read from the near the very end of the book. 5 years after Connell's death, I traveled to Santa Fe as part of my quest to know his life better. It was early autumn. Before leaving the city on a Saturday morning, I had a decision to make. Turn left out of the motel parking lot and head straight to the airport in Albuquerque, or turn right and make another attempt to find Connell's final resting place. His ashes had been laid near a tree. I could have gone either way, I told myself. What would this really accomplish? What would I get out of it? Researching and writing a biography of a deliberately elusive subject was a risky project to begin with. What difference would it make if I skipped this, what, wild ash chase? Then again, reporting a life means turning over every stone, tracing every thread that might lead to a mote of meaning. Robert Caro's great advice, learned as an investigative reporter before becoming one of our supreme biographers, was, quote, turn every page. Sure, I could save the task for another trip, but why not here and now? The silly, scolding things we do to our inner selves in a decisive moment. So in a split second, propelled by a sense that I would regret it if I left that part of this journey on the table, I turned right. And soon I was heading up Canyon Road to try again. 2 days earlier, I'd passed through the tourist choke street lined with art galleries and restaurants on the way to a couple of possible memorial spots, but I never located a tree that looked like the one in a picture Janet Zimmerman, Connell's niece, I would say, had sent me. This was where she had poured his ashes. Her directions were unclear. I drove on a bit longer and eventually gave up and turned around. Later, I realized that I should have driven just a little farther. So after a breakfast burrito at Cafe Pasquale's, I set out again on a crisp and bright weekend morning. It was one of those early fall days Connell himself might have been thinking about when he wrote to his friend Max Steele of the big, big sky of great cumulus. The drive took little more than 5 minutes. I got out at a parking lot, maybe the one mentioned by Janet, but again saw nothing like the tree I thought I was looking for. Oh well, I prepared just to offer a generic gesture. Peace, Evan. I'll try to do you right. Throughout this excursion, I could appreciate the empathy with which Jean Cantu regarded Connell's last wish, which was to be connected to the land. Quote, I think he was so enthralled with that whole thing, how old this land is, how much has gone on in this area, how many different kinds of people, that combination. I think he fell hook, line, and sinker and wanted eventually to be part of that landscape. My husband said the dirt got in his blood, and that's it. That's all it takes. I got back in the car and within a few seconds spotted a turnout at the edge of the dirt road that I'd missed earlier. Right next to it and down a slight incline stood a pine tree that may or may not have resembled the one in the photo. I walked over and took a couple of steps into the brush and branch covered slope. At the base of the tree was a patch of light colored dirt that just might have once held a layer of dust and bones I saw in Zimmerman's picture. Or not, I have no idea. Nevertheless, surely by now the ashes would have washed away. Still, as everyone knows, life is all about the journey, not the destination. And at the least, this pilgrimage gave me something important, a sense of the finality, dust to dust, of a man who ventured through the physical and intellectual worlds on his own terms. From Connell, quote, as Horace wrote, we're dust and shadow, pulvis et umbra sumus. And as Connell also wrote, some artists are like onions, layer upon layer of membranes. Quote, if you continue peeling in hopes of catching him, you end up with nothing in your hand, close quote. Such is the writer's dilemma. The anecdote goes on from there, but that seemed like a good stopping point.
Yeah, as a local Santa Fe, and I have to say, Desert Solitaire was my favorite chapter to read.
Oh,
you reference all the Santa Fe haunts that he went to, and I had to go revisit them all myself. So let's start. What was it about Evan Connell that drew you personally into researching and writing this book?
Yeah, I had been a book critic, book review editor since the mid 1980s. I just missed Connell's book, Son of the Morning Star. But I was always sort of on the edge of his world in a lot of ways. Here in Kansas City, he came from Kansas City. We had friends who lived in the house he grew up in and spent time in parties. So we had that sort of odd physical connection. A colleague of mine, shortly after Son of the Morning Star, became such a great success. A colleague of mine wrote a profile of him for our Sunday magazine. And I was, certainly aware of his work. This was right before he moved to Santa Fe. But so over the years, I never, really wrote about him in full, but I was the arts editor of the newspaper when he came back to Kansas City for the filming of Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, and that was a big production, and we covered that whole movie scene pretty well. And then later on, I assigned people to write about him, but I never really did a full-fledged Connell piece of my own until he died, and I whipped up pretty good obit, I would say, that ran on our front page in 2013. And so shoot ahead a few years. I have just finished writing my Hemingway book, and I'm waiting for it to be published. And I'm poking around, wondering what am I going to do next. And literally, I made a list of things that didn't really grab me, but literally one morning I woke up, got out of bed, stood up, and his name was on my brain, and I said, "That's it."
That's awesome. Thank you. So let's start from the beginning. What was Evan Connell like as a kid? What did his life look like growing up?
Yeah, Evan was born into a fairly well-off Kansas City family. He lived less than a mile to my right, and his father was a doctor. His mother was a homemaker. They lived a very comfortable existence. He was smart. He learned to read quite intensely in grade school. He appreciated reading and spent a lot of time doing that. He was kind of a quiet kid, as we discovered from not only his family and others who knew him. He was a Boy Scout. He was an okay student, but he was kind of brilliant in that he kind of knew what he wanted. He seemed to know what he wanted to do in life. Part of which was to sort of rebel against his parents, like we all do.
Definitely.
Even I should add, even during the Depression years, his family was, he went to summer camp. He went to a prosperous high school. They did not seem to be quite affected by the Depression as others might have been.
Yeah. Why did some refer to him as a mute?
Yeah. Well, he was a quiet. He was an observer. He didn't talk a lot, and in social situations he could be very awkward. He sat around the edges. He looked at people, but he didn't necessarily engage with them, including women down the line as he was much more of an adult. But he had a very close circle of very good friends with whom he could laugh and over dinner and perform in some ways. As an anecdote about him breaking out in song at the dinner table once. But with most people he was just uncomfortable, and he just did not open up, and I heard that word all over and over again throughout my contacts.
Yeah. After he served in the military, he goes to college. What did he initially study at college?
He actually started college before joining the Navy. He spent 2 years at Dartmouth. He flunked out of chemistry. His father sort of expected him to follow in his footsteps in pre-med and eventually become a doctor. Evan didn't really want to do that. And anyway, after 2 years, he had some writing classes. He was certainly interested in writing. After 2 years, joined the Navy, became a pilot trainee, and then eventually an instructor. Never left the country, however. There's one anecdote in the book about his flight, a near fatal flight above Albuquerque. That's kind of interesting. But after the Navy, after the war ended, he came back to Kansas City briefly, finished his education at the University of Kansas. Still was kind of torn between writing and making art. He was really interested in art, and he sketched a lot of women. And there's an anecdote in a life drawing class that he writes about in more than one story. But his interest lay in both places. Eventually, he decided after using the GI Bill to spend a year at Stanford in a writing program, actually Wallace Stegner's first class of creative writing fellows at Stanford, and then another year in Columbia, New York. In both places, he made art as well as writing, but he finally decided that he thought, and it seemed like he could actually make money writing. He sold his very first story in 1946 while in school, and then continued to, progress as a writer, and even won an O. Henry Award in 1949 and another one in 1951, and so he began to see himself more and more as a writer and less as an artist. Although throughout much of his adult life, he continued making art, and a few paintings, and a lot of sketches, live model sketching.
And I heard through your research, maybe it was a librarian who found a drawing he sketched up of an invention, maybe like a gun.
Oh, right, yeah. It was one of the scuriest little moments was when I was shown. It was a librarian in Santa Cruz, California, pointed me towards a patent that Connell had applied for the oddest of inventions. It was a bicycle-mounted toy machine gun. And in digging around, I went to I accessed the patent office and got the application. I'd seen up until then only the illustration of this oddity, and yes, it was a very odd discovery. Don't know where it came from. He was in the engineering club in high school, and he wrote some fantasy stories that are now lost. And I'm just imagining that he was living in Santa Cruz at the time and reading gas meters. So he wasn't very productive as a writer at the time. He was doing some writing, but imagine walking around the neighborhoods of Santa Cruz. He was inspired to think about such things. Anyway, it was a fun discovery, yes.
Yeah, that was super fun. Fun. So we kind of start talking about how he began his writing. Who or what really encouraged him to pursue it as a career?
Well, Wallace Stegner was an early mentor and encouraged him. He had an agent or two, a couple of whom were very scolding of his sort of excesses as a writer, and he began to get a handle on that. He finally, landed an agent who ended up being in the late 40s, ended up being his agent for the next 40 years or more. And she helped direct him to editors who, some of which appreciated him, some of whom didn't. Finally, he goes to Paris, after not much progress in California. He decides to go to Paris for a couple of years. He meets a writer by the name of Max Steele, who had just won a big award and published his first novel, and they became friends. And Steele saw in Connell very early on kind of amazing talent. He even writes to his mother and said he's a strange guy, very quiet, but he can write like nobody else. So there's that quietude again. And there's that really early sign that people really are knocked out by his writing. Through Max, Max was reading manuscripts for the Paris Review, which was just beginning to get organized. This was the William Styron, George Plimpton, Peter Matheson literary journal that launched in 1953. Connell was eager to sell a story to him, and soon, I think it's the second or third issue, in 1953, he has lunch with Plimpton, who announces that he's going to take one of Connell's stories. And I sort of play with that a little bit in the book and suggested that was kind of the beginning of his real serious literary career. Unfolded pretty, kind of frustratingly, but in a way kind of fast throughout the 50s as he built up to publish first a book of short stories and then Mrs. Bridge, which came out in 1959.
So what is it about Paris that has so many writers and artists? What called to Connell to make his way to Paris and travel Europe during this time?
Yeah, at one point much later on, he said he wished he'd gotten to Paris earlier and stayed longer. This was after the World War II. We know all about Paris in the 1920s, of course, the Jazz Age and Hemingway and Joyce and Pound and all those people, creative people, ended up in Paris after the First World War. Another kind of influx of creatives ended up in Paris after the war, and it's rather interesting in that it was a very diverse group of people: Black jazz musicians, Black writers like Richard Wright, as well as the whole coterie of American literati who knew that Paris was pretty cheap and it was pretty enticing and had a culture that just supported and honored and valued literature in a way that we might know and notice today that literature is not always as valued as we think it should be in this country. So it was just an attraction. He spent a few months, kind of dark months in Barcelona. He traveled around Europe and had some interesting experiences, but also wrote very prolifically in those 2 years that he was here. He was there. He left Paris 1953 and had this sort of idea for a novel about someone kind of like his mother that after landing in San Francisco, he wrote very quickly, at least the early drafts, and the rest becomes history within a few years.
So how did you go about the research for this book on Connell?
Yeah, when I first jumped into it, I learned I had a contact through his family, and I also got in touch with his longtime editor, Jack Shoemaker, at Counterpoint Press in California, and I learned that his papers were at Stanford, and I went out and spent some time pouring through his papers, correspondence, some manuscripts, a lot of screenplay drafts and things like that. I didn't look at every single page of the manuscripts, which would be a whole different project, but I looked at virtually every letter and gathered as much material as I could. It also gave me a chance to look at correspondence that he might have sent to people who had sent him letters. And so I started going to other libraries to find letters that he wrote to his friends and writers. There's archives for his publishers here and there. One of the really great discoveries for me was going to the University of North Carolina, where Max Steele's papers are, and discovering a whole cache of letters, 50 or more letters mostly from the 1950s, which gave me a picture of his daily life in San Francisco and a lot of his interests and his humor and his, snarky political, musings and literary kind of experiences. It was just really wonderful to kind of find those letters, and it helped a lot fill in a big gap.
So exciting. It's like a treasure hunt. What was the most difficult information that you were trying to find And what was the most exciting discovery in your research?
Yeah, well, that cast of letters, it brought me one thing. There's a total. It's still sort of inexplicable. I mean, you can sense possibly the relationship that Connell had with his parents. Um, in 1958, Connell has finished Mrs. Bridge essentially, and portions of it a couple of years earlier had appeared in the Paris Review, and another swath of small chapters appeared in a San Francisco literary magazine called Contact just that year, 1958. Well, Connell's mother died that summer, and he comes back to Kansas City. And when he gets back to San Francisco, he writes to Max Steele and says, I've just come back from Kansas City, where my mother has died. She had had cancer in recent years. Her health had been failing. And he tells Max, and there's nothing more to be said. And in fact, he never really ever said anything more about his mother. And I just don't, wanted to try to find out why. And so that becomes it's a mystery that in some ways remains a mystery. Certainly explains. I mean, it's certainly the emotional void that existed in his family, as it exists in the Bridge family of those two novels. It's not hard to connect those dots, but it was sort of an astounding opening paragraph of a letter when I came across that one in Chapel Hill. Most exciting, hard to say. There were wonderful discoveries in a lot of his letters. I traveled to San Francisco and Sausalito. I didn't follow in every footstep he would have taken around. He traveled around the world a couple times. He followed his interest. He went to San Francisco. He went to South America and Central America several times to pursue his interest in pre-Columbian artworks, which didn't exactly begin in Santa Fe and Taos, but certainly accelerated there. But sort of the things I sort of left on the table. I did go to Paris 1 year, and I did sit in the Cafe Tournon where he and Plimpton had lunch. That famous lunch, and it had been renovated. It's hard to say exactly. It wasn't as smoky as the early period descriptions had it. But anyway, it was good to be there and see where the Paris Review offices were, and to kind of sense the neighborhoods and the bars and coffee places that Connell would have experienced.
That's so cool and important for your research.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who are some of the writers that influenced Evan Connell's?
Yeah. He borrowed from everybody and admits it. He was as he was learning to write, and as he was writing some of his early stories, multiple times he talks about borrowing an early, very long story from the 50s called Arcturus, is a borrowing from Thomas Mann's novella Disorder and Early Sorrow. And George Plimpton recognized that right away and rejected the story because it was too much like that story. So, but other people published it, and it's still I think it's still one of his great stories. He borrowed and wrote a story in this kind of inspired by Flaubert. He talks about Chekhov. He talks about Hemingway in a bit. He can't read Faulkner. Doesn't like, and in a way, he doesn't like contemporary, fiction all that much. But he liked reading classical material. history. He was a very eclectic reader, and there's in one letter to Max, he's pulling together two of his more unusual books. One was called Notes from a Bottle Found on the Beach at Carmel, and the later one, 10 years later, it's called Points for a Compass Rose. They're kind of epic poems, book-like poems made up of fragments of interwoven meditations on history and even contemporary politics, and they're like commonplace books, but there's also threads that are just that kind of exciting. And at one point, he tells Max Steele that he's plagiarizing everybody. He goes to the library, pulls all these nuggets, and he uses them. He recasts them for his own, kaleidoscopic purposes in those kinds of works. When he gets around to writing Son of the Morning Star, it's also kind of kaleidoscopic, but in a much more, it's not exactly linear, but it's much more of it's not linear, it's not conventional, but it has a kind of a form that spirals, and it's just really enticing. But it's also based on kind of fragments and nuggets of interesting facts that he loved to kind of dwell on and learn from.
Thank you. I'm also curious, what did Connell's family think of his writing, if they even read it? And if they did, what were their reactions to Miss and Mr. Bridge?
Yeah, it's hard. So as I just mentioned, his mother had died before Mrs. Bridge came out. I doubt she ever saw the Paris Review or Contact magazine with those fragments. I got conflicting reports on whether his father read either or both of those books. He had them. He told one writer that he did read them, but other people thought he might not have. Especially Mr. Bridge, which is a little harsher book than Mrs. Bridge, and the portrait of the father, not Connell's father, but in some ways inspired by him, was really dark in a lot of ways, that's only hinted at in Mrs. Bridge. But his sister was a faithful follower, and she might have been. She knew that in Mrs. Bridge, the sisters of Douglas Bridge were not her, and she knew that he wasn't portraying her. Her name was Barbara or Bobby, and so I think she was very proud of him, and for all the years of their lives together, they had an interesting friendship and relationship as brother and sister. One of the discoveries, which was great in Stanford, it was sort of it took me a while to get my hands on these, but there were 200 letters from Connell to his sister Bob's, he always called her, that had not really been processed out at the library, and were in a box, and it took me a while to get the archivist to deliver them to me in their reading room. But those 200 letters, and just going back to surprises and discoveries, those were wonderful, because those were later in his life, from the late 70s onward. And again, they gave me, daily sort of, almost like diaries. There were of his life. They had this running political argument. They didn't agree whatsoever. Connell was once called a cranky liberal. His sister who is still alive, was a very conservative, fell into kind of the right-wing conspiracy theories and all that stuff. And she was very also a religious, born-again Christian, in a way that Connell would never have appreciated, I guess, or followed in that path. So, but despite those conflicts, they would gig each other a little bit, but they loved each other, and it was a interesting relationship. She was so proud of him, and he always told her what was up with the books he was writing, and whether she liked them or not, it really didn't matter on her end. But she was just proud of him.
I imagine she never visited Paris then.
She traveled with her husband a little bit, and he, some of his, letters to her were kind of like travel advice. If they're going to Mexico and do this and do that, and there was a trip to the Pacific, South Pacific that he writes to her about that was really beautiful, kind of travelogue. Kind of, yes. So they were not beyond those kinds of experiences, but it was just when you get you know to that political thread, it's a little touchy.
I gotcha. Why do you think Connell never married or had a real significant relationship or
Yeah, I mean, he did have a significant relationship, and I'll get back to that in just a second. What I was told by friends, a couple of women friends, he just had this emotional wall that he put up with people, and wouldn't let, even though he had numerous. The quote in the book is, I had. I'd gotten a hold of a woman who had a fling with Evan in the late '60s in San Francisco, and when I mentioned that to Anne Lamott, the writer who was a good friend, um, and Annie said that, well, everybody had a fling with Evan, and Annie would have been an exception in that she was the daughter of a writer by the name of Ken Lamott, who worked with Evan and co-edited Contact magazine in the early '60s in San Francisco, and they were very close friends. He died young; he died in his '50s, but anyway, Connell, sometime in the early '60s, and I go through this sort of this kind of mystery, trying to figure out when and where. Well, I know where, but when he actually met a woman by the name of Gail Garnett, who, if anybody in the audience is of a certain age, will remember Gail Garnett as the famous singer of a hit song in 1964 called "We'll Sing in the Sunshine." Gail was also an actress, played many roles on television and movies, and she was a free spirit. She might have been from New Zealand. She might have been Hawaiian. She might have been 16. She might have been 20. All these things come up with Gail, but they had a very passionate couple of years together, and then sort of fell apart, but remained very good friends and very close friends. And there was one point in time when it becomes clear that if Evan ever had married anybody, it would have been Gail. This was a late discovery on her part, but they were too much of free spirits and too much in their own worlds. Evan, from time to time, is quoted as saying that, he wanted to be a writer, and he didn't want to marry somebody and not be able to devote his full time to a family. Then again, if he knew he was going to be a writer, he couldn't devote full time to his family. He didn't want to have a relationship like his parents had a relationship. His father knew only work, pretty much, worked long hours, and frankly did not have a close relationship with the kids. And so all those things are going on in his mind. And he, you know, he dated a lot, but he never took the ultimate step.
And just a side note, he was very handsome.
He was very, everybody saw that. And you know, when he comes back from the Navy, he's at the University of Kansas, and he wears his leather pilot jacket and had grown a mustache, and Katie barred the door. One fun discovery I should have mentioned is that in college in Lawrence, University of Kansas, I had come across a very small reference to the fact that Connell kind of wrote for a campus humor magazine. And so I went to the library at Kansas, and sure enough, librarians unearthed this campus humor magazine called The Bitter Bird, which Connell wrote a little bit, but mostly contributed sketches and illustrations and cartoons. And most of the cartoons and sketches had to do with women. They were, it was a wild discovery to find him, you know, doing that, exploring those talents. He wrote one story for The Bitter Bird that's rather fascinating, and one bit of doggerel poetry. But there were some other nuggets of his campus life that I found in those pages. That was a fun discovery. But his good looks were legendary, and really, you know, led him down a lot of paths.
Yes. So how did Evan Connell make his way to the Southwest, to Santa Fe?
Well, he, I can't say exactly the first time he made it to Santa Fe, but he was his family did take some summer vacations in the mountains in Colorado. So he's certainly aware of the Western landscape and loved it. In the 50s, when he's settled in San Francisco, he does take some road trips, at least to Denver, where he spends a month or two one summer, and some other road trips, including his first visit to the Little Bighorn battlefield that he thought about writing about as early as 1962. But I mean, he'd seen the battlefield on a road trip in the mid 50s, and there was a mention of this possible book project as early, like I said, 1962. It was only 20 years later that he began writing a piece about Custer that he thought was going to be an essay, but ended up being this big book. So he sees Santa Fe. He had a friendship that developed with a man named Gus Blaisdell, who was at the University of New Mexico, owned a bookstore, who wrote a scholarly essay about Connell, about his first 6 books that appeared in the New Mexico Quarterly in 1966. And out of that, a correspondence began, and a friendship, and eventually even when Evan finally moved to Santa Fe, he'd often drive down to Albuquerque to see Gus. And but he just had this thing about Santa Fe that he, as early as you know, he's in Sausalito, and the rents are going up and the traffic is bad, and he starts thinking, well, I wonder what it would be like to live in Santa Fe, which by 1989, he finally, after the great success of Son of the Morning Star and the money he's made, and he's able finally to make that move.
Thank you. Now, also on a personal side note, I worked at the De Vargas Mall
Mhm.
in my undergraduate, and I would see Cormac McCarthy there and Shirley MacLaine. And I was not aware of Connell at the time.
Mhm.
But reading your book, I realized I had to have crossed paths
You-
with him
you-
as he frequented Santa Fe Bar and Grill,
yeah.
um, which is so fun to think about. I wish I
Well,
knew.
he frequented it, and basically as a loner. And everybody I talked to, I have friends in Santa Fe, and talked to people who I didn't know before this. Even though Evan lived there for 24 years, he did not have a high profile. He kept a very low profile, and he wrote through the 90s and into the new millennium. He published his last book in 2008, and then had serious uh, knee surgeries, and that ended up um, uh, pretty much ended up ending his writing career. But he people didn't know he was there even. So he wasn't out in public. I mean, he met people. He was interviewed. He drank alone, or he drank with friends on occasion when they came to visit. Uh, I tried to track down a story that, and wondering whether Evan had ever encountered or talked with Cormac McCarthy at the Santa Fe Bar and Grill. And you can only imagine what that conversation would be like. And who knows? I couldn't find. McCarthy is not exactly accessible, and the person who would have known that, who sort of secondhand, basically saying they never met. He also is no longer. He was a person who's no longer with us. So it was really hard to pin that one down. But sure. So I think in his last several years before moving to assisted living, he spent maybe every night at the Santa Fe Bar and Grill, had dinner. He didn't cook for himself, so he took most of his meals out, and that was a regular place. At one time, I pick up on the fact that he eats breakfast almost every morning at Burrito and Company, and he lived just 4 or 5 blocks from there on what would be the north edge of the Plaza District. Um, he uh, when his niece came to town, they went to the Inn of the Anasazi, or he'd meet people for drinks or dinner at La Fonda, and other fancy hotels. And there was one story which I write about, when a reporter came to town. They end up at the San Francisco Street Bar and Grill, um, and that became too confusing for my editor. So I think I can't remember if I actually took the name of that out, because she was confused by Santa Fe Bar and Grill and San Francisco Street Bar and Grill. And anyway, can't quite remember how that came out. But yeah, so he was not a stranger to a number of those places, and I did follow some of his footsteps in all of those places.
So he had to have lived very close to where we do the burning of Zozobra. I'm curious if you know, was he a fan of Santa Fe's markets or the annual burning of Zozobra?
Right. Yeah. No, I mentioned that he would not have been a fan of the Zozobra thing, which I saw my very first trip to Santa Fe in 1985. Totally unexpected. I knew nothing about it at the time. But I don't think that would have been, or certainly what that has become, which is kind of almost like a Mardi Gras, drunk fest. Sorry if I'm offending anybody in the audience, but so I don't think that would have been his thing. But I do think, and I'm pretty sure, he did enjoy the Indian markets. in August, despite the heat. And part of that was his interest in the culture and interest in his own collecting.
Thank you. I just have a couple more questions, and then we'll check in on our attendees. If they have any questions or comments, feel free to write it in our chat or Q&A. Of all of Connell's writing, what titles or essays do you consider required reading?
Well, certainly Mrs. Bridge, which remains one of the great American novels of the 20th century. I mean, and continues to be referred in that way. It's just a beautiful book. Together with Mr. Bridge, it's quite a portrait of upper crust white American society of mid 20th century. But I also point out, and I've got a piece that's waiting to land here sometime soon, and I write about this in the book, especially related to Mr. Bridge. But I have a piece about the Bridge novels and race, and what they reveal about race relations in America in the 20th century. And it's there's a lot to chew on in those two novels. Son of the Morning Star, I'll tell you, just I'll repeat what I just heard from a friend of Connell's who read my book and really liked my book. Thank you. And she did what I'm hoping everybody will do, which is go back to Connell's books. And she told me, the first time she tried to read Son of the Morning Star years ago, didn't quite get into it. She, as a result of my book, went back to Son of the Morning Star and realized what an amazing book it is, and said, this is the greatest book of history I've ever read. I mean, it's just one of those things. It really is remarkable. And I can see why some people are sort of turned off by the non-linearity of it. But it is just amazing book. As I mentioned in that chapter, Larry McMurtry, of all people, the late Larry McMurtry, once writing a review or of some Western books, says he was asked at least 3 times by publishers to write the Custer story, and he pointed to, and he always pointed to Son of the Morning Star and said, why bother? It's been done. And so that is certainly, if anyone has an interest in American and Western history, and our troubled history of with indigenous Americans as well, it's fascinating and compelling. I mentioned earlier the two what he refers to as notes projects, notes from a bottle found on the beach at Carmel and points for a compass rose, I think are fascinating. There's one in the points for a compass rose, even there's an embedded chess game, which I tracked, that I thought was kind of interesting, in addition to his gleanings from history and his complaints about the Vietnam War and all the philosophical meditation that's going on in those books. I have to mention, of course, especially for this audience, the book called The Connoisseur, the novel about his character's obsession with pre-Columbian artists. He sees something in the book. It begins in Taos. The actual epiphany occurred in Santa Fe, as I understand it, but his character sees a figure on a shelf in a shop and immediately is attracted into that world. And the story is his sort of education, some of it rough, but some of it really interesting in art and fakery, and that world of the pre-Columbian trade. I think it's a really fun read. Anyway, so that he did everything. He wrote. There were 60 or so short stories. I'd say a good half of them are really, really fine. Not everything is wonderful, are great, but there are many great stories in his collected stories. His travel and history essays in a book collected called The Aztec Treasure House. They were originally published in two separate books in the late 70s, early 80s, but later recollected as Aztec Treasure. I think those historical essays are really fun. He goes into all sorts of mysteries and about travelers and alchemists and Western history. And so he's, this is one of the things, as I talk about in the book, that makes Connell difficult to for the literary community, book critics, publishers. It makes it difficult for him to have this kind of wide reputation because he was so unpredictable and always jumping from one thing to another, and that didn't play well in New York and with people who just wanted the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, he definitely didn't do the same thing over and over again. Margot asks, did he write about Santa Fe or New Mexican history?
Not in big ways. He did a piece about Mesa Verde that is in the Aztec Treasure House, which I mentioned. Inscription Rock. He did write about the Southwest. I can't say he wrote much about Santa Fe per se. There's a wonderful essay he did about San Francisco for Holiday Magazine, which that was a nice find in the early 60s. I wish he had written something like that about Santa Fe. But not that I found. But as I said, the Connoisseur certainly has aspects and visits to Santa Fe.
Thank you.
Mostly takes place in New York.
Blaise writes, do you think appreciation of Connell suffered from comparison with his contemporaries, which were who?
Yeah, well, I started to talk about that, about his unpredictability. You know, Connell emerged at the same time as writers like John Updike and Philip Roth. They were Roth and Connell and a dozen other books were finalists for the National Book Award for 1959. Roth ended up winning for Goodbye Columbus. He attracted the attention of John Updike, who ended up having a much bigger career. He was certainly aware of, the likes of Norman Mailer. Connell was not a self-promoter, and that really kind of worked against him as well. He didn't teach, so he didn't have students who would, beat his drum, or he just didn't have a natural community. And again, this sort of insular world that he lived in. I mean, except in San Francisco, Sausalito, he was in some ways he was on the wrong side of the bay. This was the time of the San Francisco literary renaissance and the Beats and Ginsberg and Kerouac and Ferlinghetti and all those things were happening. What Connell was doing and what Contact Magazine was doing was seen as kind of conservative, and so he didn't have that same sort of pizzazz that the Beat attention. And I deal with this a little bit in the book. There were some kind of fun episodes relating to that. But yeah, he he hated promoting himself. He didn't want to go on publicity tours. He spoke at the occasional women's auxiliary luncheon to promote a book, but he hated that kind of thing. There were indications that he did end up being interviewed a good fair number of times over the years, and finding a lot of those interviews, they were certainly useful to me.
Thank you. The same person wrote, fascinated by his connection to Gail Garnett.
Yeah.
How did they meet? How long? How? Why?
Yeah. So I did. This is more of the story I was alluding to earlier. Connell and his buddies at the Contact magazine, the magazine offices were right near a bar in Sausalito called the No Name Bar. And so there was a lot of gathering there, just like there was a lot of gathering at the Café Tournon in Paris. Connell also played chess there. He didn't drink a lot, as best as I could tell, at least in those years. And one day, as Gail Garnett tells the story, and I visited with Gail a few times, one day she walks in, sees this most handsome man, and goes over and strikes up a conversation. There are stories that indicate that she was telling this story that she was 16 years old and he was about 40. She obviously looked a little older than her age. In poking around and trying to find a sort of paper trail on Gail, I'm sorry to have done this, Gail, if you're out there. I've kind of lost track of her, and I'm worried. But she was probably more like, as I said earlier, she was probably more like 20. I found little dots. The fact that in 1960, which is when maybe her story is partly real, she was in the cast of a touring Broadway production, Susie Wong, and which ended up playing for a month in San Francisco, which very well would have put her in line to join her, fellow actors or whatever, to hop over to the No Name Bar in Sausalito. Very possible they met that year. I still maintain she was probably 18 at that time, not 16. My hunch is that they actually began a relationship a few years later, 1964, after her record comes out. The earliest letter from her to him in his archives is dated January 1965, and it's a fun letter and includes a drawing of herself unclothed. They clearly had a flirty time recently, and anyway, so my sense is, as I write about this, that they actually began dating or had this affair beginning late 1964, 1965, not in 1960, as she might have maintained.
One final question, and we'll wrap this up for everyone. How does it feel to be Connell's first biographer?
Yeah, I knew that I felt like I had a big responsibility. But I also know that, in the world of biography, and I just happen to be involved in an organization, Biographers International Organization, which has exposed me in recent years to the wide world, big tent of biography. I know that, for certain subjects, how many hundreds or thousands of biographies are there about Abe Lincoln, for example? But other, how many brand new and newish and continuing titles are there about Sylvia Plath? And each one is different. Okay. But knowing that, I doubt that anybody would come back at Evan Connell. Because he's a much lesser known figure. And I found everything there was, as far as I'm concerned, I found everything there was to find out about him, and wrote the book as I would write it. Somebody could come along and do it completely differently. And there are other ways to write about him and write about his work. And I'm hoping that more people will write about his work Scholars have begun to kind of go back and look at some of his stories in different ways. And so I think there's a discovery of him, but I did feel a certain responsibility to try to get him right. And I've really been, heartened by some of the responses I've gotten from people who actually knew him, and people who had different experiences with him, family, friends, and others. And I just feel like like I wrote in that ending episode. I feel like I hope I did him right. I'm sure there are some people who are gonna, you know, disagree with me, perhaps. I don't know, but yeah, it felt like a responsibility to do the first book in a way that I wouldn't embarrass myself.
Well, I don't think you embarrassed. Well, thank you a million times, Steve Paul.
Thank you so
For
much.
this biography. Thanks for doing this with our community. Thanks to all who joined us this afternoon. For those of you who are with us, I will email you a link to a discount code, so you can purchase a copy of Literary Alchemist directly from UPress, Missouri. We have it here at the Santa Fe Public Library on the shelves. It's a beautiful book. Of course, we have Connell's other books on our shelves at the library. Be sure to check it out. If you don't purchase it from UPress Missouri EDU directly, you can also request it from our local bookstores or find it elsewhere online. There's a few different places you can get it. Thank you so much, Steve, Paul, and best wishes to all of your adventures and whatever is next. I look forward to seeing it and reading it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and everyone who attended.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it very much.
Stay safe, everyone. Read Literary Alchemists and have a good night.
Bye-bye.